Out of nowhere, as we were winding down one Sunday evening, getting ready for bed, my wife, Lindsey, said, "We need to talk." I guess I shouldn't have been too surprised. She'd been acting off all weekend. I'd asked her a few times if something was bothering her, but she just kept saying, "No, I'm fine. Just got a lot on my mind." To be honest, I was feeling the same way. The recession had hit us both hard, and we went from having just enough to live out our dreams to barely scraping by. Not that anyone else we knew was doing much better. But Lindsey had always struggled with how sudden our financial situation changed. She grew up not having much, and now that we had lost some of our luxuries, like our yearly vacation, it hit her harder than me. She never came out and blamed me directly, but her comments when we talked about money told a different story. That night, I hugged Lindsey tightly, telling her I loved her, but she didn't hug me back. Instead, she did something she almost never did, poured herself a stiff drink of whiskey and didn't offer me any. Immediately, I could tell something serious was about to go down, and she needed that drink to build up the nerve. After dinner, we sat in front of the TV, barely speaking. I couldn't even remember what was on, my mind was too busy racing, wondering what Lindsey was going to say. When we headed upstairs to bed, instead of our usual routine, watching the news, maybe making love, there was this thick tension between us. Our intimacy had been struggling lately, just like everything else since the financial crash. As I finished brushing my teeth, she walked into the bathroom and hit me with the news. "Someone at work invited me on a fully paid ski trip to Colorado," she said. "A colleague had to back out, and the tickets are non-refundable. We're leaving Wednesday morning and coming back Monday." I rinsed my mouth and turned to her. "Someone at work?" I repeated, "That's an interesting way to put it. Sounds like a guy invited you." Lindsey's face was filled with guilt. She didn't even have to say anything. I continued, "So, who's this guy that invited a married woman on a ski trip?" She avoided my eyes. "You don't know him," she said quietly. "That's odd," I replied. "I thought I knew everyone you worked with." "I do," she said, "but he's not someone I work with directly." Now I was really confused. "Didn't you just say it was someone from work?" "I said someone at work," she corrected. I was getting frustrated. "All right, enough of the wordplay. Who's the guy?" "His name's Mike. We've had lunch together a few times in the cafeteria. He works upstairs on the 5th floor," she admitted. I felt the blood rushing to my head. "How long have you been seeing him?" I asked, my voice rising. Lindsey started to cry. "I'm not cheating on you." "How could you say that?" "Maybe because you've been having lunch with another man and forgot to mention it," I shot back. "Now, he's inviting you on a ski trip across the country? And we haven't even been close in a month?" "It's not like that," she sobbed. "Mike's a nice guy. His girlfriend dumped him, and he didn't want the tickets to go to waste. It's all paid for, the hotel, the lift tickets, everything. It won't cost me a thing." "How convenient," I said sarcastically. "So what's his last name?" "Mike, or maybe Robert. I'm not sure." "You've got me so upset I can't even think straight," she stammered. "So, you're going to fly across the country with a guy whose last name you don't even know?" I shouted. "You're either lying to me or incredibly naive." The argument spiraled from there. I demanded to know who these supposed friends were that they'd be staying with. "Mike's friends," she replied. "There are 2 other couples." "So, you're going as his date?" I accused. "No. He just didn't want the ticket to go to waste," she insisted. "Why can't you just trust me? Would you trust me if I told you that some woman I met at the office invited me on vacation?" I retorted. "Bullshit. Remember how jealous you got when I was just talking to that woman at the baseball game last summer? That was different," she shot back. "You were ignoring me. And you won't be ignoring me while you're in a cabin with Mike and his friends?" I yelled. Lindsey screamed back at me and stormed out of the room. It was a long, sleepless night. We both tossed and turned until sheer exhaustion knocked us out around 2 a.m. I was up by 6, brewing coffee. She took one sip, dumped the rest in the sink, and said, "I'm going to work." At that moment, I knew she wasn't going to admit she was wrong. Lindsey was the most stubborn person I'd ever known. On the drive to work, I started thinking about how to save our marriage. Logic wasn't going to work here. This called for a more direct approach, as my grandmother used to say. About a year ago, I'd taken a chance on a young guy named Anthony, who had done some time for a robbery. He was grateful to me for giving him a second chance, always saying, "You ever need anything, boss, I've got you." Well, it was time to call in that favor. "Tony, I need your help," I told him. "Just say the word, boss," Tony replied. I filled him in on the situation and handed him a picture of Lindsey and the address of her office. She eats lunch every day at noon in the cafeteria downstairs. I need you to get a discreet picture of this guy, Mike, and figure out where he works. At the end of the day, follow him and get his license plate. "Got it, boss," Tony said confidently. "Don't worry about my time card either, I'll take care of it." The rest of the day, I was a wreck, convinced Lindsey was with this guy, probably bad-mouthing me over lunch. Around 1:10, my phone rang. "Boss, it's Tony." I got the picture. They were talking, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. Afterward, I followed him into the elevator. He didn't even look at me. He went into Suite 510, Cameron Industrial LLC. "Great work," I said. "But you're only halfway there." "No worries, boss. I'll stick to him like glue," Tony replied confidently. I hung up and pulled up Google, typing in every combination of Mike Harris's and Robert Harris's I could think of, but there were too many hits, and none of them looked like the guy in the picture. I searched Cameron Industrial, and sure enough, they were a big player in the metals industry. No employee names were listed online, so I called the company. "Hi, can I speak to Mike Harris?" I asked. "Sorry, we don't have anyone by that name," the receptionist replied. "Oh, my mistake. I meant Mike Harris," I quickly corrected myself. "Nope, no one here by that name either." "Are you sure you've got the right company?" "My bad," I said, "wrong number." I hung up, staring at my screen, trying to figure out who this guy was when my phone rang again. "Boss, it's Tony," came the voice on the other end. I was taking a smoke break in the bathroom, and guess who walked in? Mike, Robert, whatever his name is. Except those aren't his real names. "Did he see you?" I asked, my voice low but tense. "Nope," Tony replied. I was about to light up when he walked in. I overheard someone call him Mr. Harris. Tony paused for a second, then continued, "Turns out his real name is Robert Harris. Guy seems like a real piece of work." Tony went on to tell me how Harris casually took a cigarette from him like they were buddies. I commended him on his smooth handling of the situation, but the whole thing was starting to make my blood boil. Unfortunately, I was stuck in a late meeting and couldn't dig deeper into this Harris guy. As I pulled into the garage that evening, Tony called again. Harris left the office early, around 3. Took the subway and I followed him back to a basement apartment at 2411 North Kensington Avenue. The place looks like a dump. Rusty bars on the windows, no curtains, and trash piled up outside. He didn't leave again. Just tossed some pizza boxes and 2 big garbage bags out. Once he went back in, I grabbed the bags. "Wait, you grabbed the bags?" I asked, surprised. "Yeah, boss. That's how guys like me learn to steal identities. People throw away way too much personal stuff," Tony said. "I don't know who this Mike Harris character is, but the name Robert Harris was all over the papers I found in the trash." "Nice work. We'll talk more tomorrow," I replied, hanging up. My mind was spinning, though. This wasn't just some harmless ski trip. When I walked in, Lindsey was sitting at the kitchen table, biting into a burger, fries on the side. She hadn't bothered to get me anything, but I wasn't in the mood to care. I sat across from her and laid down the terms, speaking slowly but firmly. "You need to come clean," I said, staring directly into her eyes. "Full disclosure. I want this guy's full name, his address, phone number, email, and where he works. And I want copies of the plane tickets and the cabin address. If something happens, I need to know where you are and with whom." She scoffed, waving me off like I was being ridiculous. "You're overreacting. Let me finish." I snapped, slamming my hand down on the table. "I also need the names and numbers of the other couples going with you. Now you can speak." She looked cornered, almost caught. "He didn't rent the cabin. It's his uncle's place. And, Mike doesn't have a cell phone." "Don't have a cell phone?" I asked, my voice dripping with disbelief. "Even kids have cell phones these days." "Well, he doesn't," she snapped, defensive. If I get you all this info, will you finally stop pushing me and let me go have fun? She smiled, trying to lighten the tension, but I wasn't having it. You've got one day to get me everything, I warned. You're just jealous that I'm going to Colorado, she shot back, her voice sharp. I slammed my fist again. Jealous? You think that's what this is about? I'm pissed because in all the years we've been together, you've never once mentioned skiing. But now, out of nowhere, you're all about it, and with some guy you barely know from work? You don't see why I'd think something's up? I swear there's nothing going on, she insisted. We'll see. Just get me the info. If everything checks out, we'll talk, I replied coldly. I almost told her that her so-called friend was using a fake name, but I wanted to see Harris's reaction when things started to fall apart. That night, we slept as far apart as our queen-sized bed would allow. I kept replaying everything in my head, waiting for the right moment to spring what I'd learned on her. Surprisingly, the next morning was peaceful. Lindsey was polite, and we even had coffee together. But I knew this was just the calm before the storm. I got to the office early and paced nervously until Tony showed up. Time was running out, Lindsey was leaving soon, and this might be my last chance to save my marriage. Tony came in, lugging a large cardboard box. He'd sifted through the garbage bags, separating the junk from the real treasure. Financial records, bank statements, legal documents. This guy's a walking disaster, Tony said as he handed me a legal-sized envelope addressed to Robert Harris. Looks like the guy's getting dragged to court for not paying child support. He's got 2 kids and hasn't paid a dime in over a year. My heart raced. What else? Bench warrant for missing court over the child support case, Tony chuckled. If he so much as gets pulled over for speeding, he's headed to jail. The pile of overdraft notices and bounced checks from a San Francisco bank just added fuel to the fire. But then came the real kicker. Boss, here's something strange, Tony said, handing me a printout. The flight reservation. His ticket's round trip, but your wife's is one way. My blood went cold. One way? She had no plans to come back? Good work, Tony, I muttered. I was already thinking ahead, how to cancel the tickets, how to split them up on the flight, and how to put myself in Harris's seat without him knowing. I'd break this whole thing wide open. Then, I found something that made my stomach turn. While searching the Chicago Tribune archives, I discovered why Robert Harris was hiding behind a fake name. He was a convicted sex offender, originally from the city. His mugshot had been printed in all 3 local papers after he assaulted a woman in Fort Collins. There weren't many details, but he had taken a plea deal, serving 2 years in prison. His wife divorced him while he was locked up. And after he got out, early, thanks to overcrowding, he tracked her down and beat her so badly she was hospitalized for nearly a month. 2 felony convictions, and yet, my wife still thought he was a nice guy. I took an early lunch break and headed to the courthouse. For a few bucks, I got copies of Harris's divorce papers and arrest record. The details were sickening. He had drugged a woman on a ski trip and assaulted her. I also filled out a DIY divorce form, citing adultery. I attached time-stamped photos of Lindsey and Harris chatting in the cafeteria like a couple. My last stop was the Domestic Relations Division to file the divorce papers. The clerk stamped them with the official seal and gave me a case number. This was real now. I went back to work and told my boss I needed a few personal days. He didn't ask questions. When I got home, Lindsey was cooking a full meal, something from scratch, not out of a box. She was clearly trying to make an effort, but I knew it was just to smooth things over. When I hugged and kissed her, she responded, but it felt hollow, like we were just going through the motions. Then she pulled a folded piece of paper out of her purse. I got everything you asked for. Mike doesn't have a phone, but I found his email, and he's on Facebook. Where does he work? I asked, suspicious. He got a promotion recently, but doesn't have new business cards yet, she stammered. He, hasn't told me the details. My mind raced. I opened my laptop and started typing in the cabin address. Strike 1, I muttered under my breath. Then I checked the official Fort Collins zoning map. Strike 2. No matter how many map programs I used, the cabin didn't exist. Honey? I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. We've got a problem. I've checked the cabin address on 6 different maps, and guess what? None of them recognize it. She must have gotten the address wrong, Lindsey suggested, sounding more desperate than convincing. What about the tickets? I pressed. He said we'd get them at the airport, she answered casually. No, you get the boarding pass at the airport. You should know that from when we went to Hawaii, I countered, the tension thick in the air. I could feel her resistance growing. I tried calling the numbers she had for the other couples, but none of them worked. Online searches and even Facebook came up empty. Something wasn't right, and I knew it. Honey, I began carefully, I hate to break it to you, but none of the information Mike, or whatever his name is, gave you checks out. I can't let you go. I expected her to admit, maybe just a crack in her stubbornness, that something was off. But instead, her dinner flew across the room, smashing into the wall. She stood up, eyes blazing. You're not letting me, she screamed. Who the hell do you think you are, telling me where I can or can't go? I'm your husband, Lindsey. Why are you being so damn stubborn? I'm just trying to protect you from going on a trip with a guy who's lied about everything. You don't even know where you're actually going. He didn't lie. Maybe he just doesn't want you meddling in everything. Afraid you'll ruin his plans, she spat out, her words sharp as knives. My voice rose, matching her intensity. Is that what he's worried about? That I'll show up and ruin this little getaway? She was shaking now, her face red with anger. We're just friends. Nothing more than that. I'm going skiing, and you can't stop me. I held my ground. Fine, go skiing. But how are you paying for this? We're broke, remember? Her eyes narrowed. I've got those 2 jars of silver coins I've been saving since I was a kid. I was saving them for a trip on our 5th anniversary, but I guess I'll cash them in now. Either we go on a vacation together, or I'll use that money for a divorce attorney. Your choice. My heart dropped, but I kept my voice steady. Stop threatening me. I'm not threatening you. I'm making a promise, she said, cold and calm now. You know I always keep my promises. I didn't want to admit it, but her words cut deep. Why don't you trust me, she asked, her voice softening just a little. Mike's not trying to get between us. He just didn't want the ticket to go to waste. That guy hasn't exactly been a gentleman, Lindsey. He didn't back off when he found out you were married. That should have been enough to make you think twice. I'll pay him back for the ticket, and we can still go on a trip together, she offered, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. I shook my head. It's too late. You're leaving tomorrow, and you can't even reach him. I wasn't about to let her think I was naive. Any man who's fine with letting his wife do what you're planning isn't a real man. Think about how you're going to explain this to our family, our friends, when we get divorced. Her expression shifted, a mix of anger and desperation. Don't give me that. I promised I'd come back and make it up to you. I'll be relaxed, and everything will be fine. I gave her one last chance. You made a promise to him, but you're breaking the vows we made in front of God and our families. Lindsey didn't say anything after that. The silence hung between us like a thick fog, heavy and suffocating. We didn't even look at each other as we lay in bed, keeping as much distance as possible. I couldn't sleep. My mind was at war with itself, logic telling me to let her go, let her face the consequences of her actions, but my heart urged me to save what little was left of our marriage. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was going to give it one last shot. I woke up early, well before dawn, but Lindsey barely acknowledged me. She got furious when I snapped a picture of her with my phone. Why did you do that? She demanded. So the police have a recent photo in case they need to identify you, I replied coolly. She let out a string of curses, furiously packing her suitcase. I stood there, calm but resolute. If you board that plane with him, don't expect me to be here when you come back. Our marriage will be over, I warned. She shot me a dirty look. I know you're not that foolish. Funny, I thought the same about her. I guess we were both wrong, I said quietly before leaving the house without kissing her goodbye. I parked my car down the block and watched as she left, feeling my chest tighten with each passing second. Then I went back home, shaved off my beard and mustache, and dressed in a black suit with a white shirt and tie. It felt like a funeral, my own. The death of my marriage. I threw on sunglasses to complete the disguise and headed out, my briefcase and bags in tow for one last attempt. By 8 a.m., I was at the airport gate when Tony called. They had a big blowout outside his apartment, he said. Harris wanted to take the subway because it was cheaper, even though she offered to pay for parking. He's penny pinching already, boss. While she was in the bathroom, Tony had checked her wallet. She's got less than $1,100 on her. I don't think she's planning to use your credit cards since you canceled them, right? Yeah, they're canceled, I replied, my mind already playing out what would happen next. Lindsey's perfect ski trip was already starting to fall apart, and they hadn't even left Chicago. As they made their way to the terminal, Tony noticed something odd. This guy's heading to Fort Collins in the middle of December, and he's not even dressed for winter. No coat, no gloves. It's weird, boss. I hung up, thanking him for all his help. Lindsey's dream vacation was already in jeopardy, and she didn't even know it yet. By the time they reached the TSA checkpoint, Tony couldn't follow any further, so I was on my own. I had paid for early boarding, securing a seat toward the front of the plane. I chose the center seat, leaving the window open. If she sat next to me, I'd give her one last chance to make things right. My luck held. The man assigned to the aisle seat showed up a few minutes later, a tall, well-built guy who looked like a college athlete. The row in front of us filled up with stragglers, and I could feel the tension building. Then, I heard his voice. Hey, asshole, you're in my seat. Robert Harris barked, shoving his ticket in the face of my seatmate. Lindsey turned to the commotion, but her eyes didn't immediately recognize me. She was too busy fumbling with her suitcase. The guy in the aisle pointed out that Harris was supposed to be further back, near the bathrooms. Harris launched into a tirade, cursing the airline and demanding to sit next to his girlfriend. Lindsey stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. You should ask the man in the middle to switch seats if you really want to sit together, Lindsey suggested, still not realizing it was me. Without my beard and mustache, and with my sunglasses on, I was practically invisible to her. Meanwhile, a flight attendant approached, looking annoyed. Sir, please take your assigned seat. This flight is fully booked, and we need to finish boarding, she insisted. Harris persisted, waving his ticket around. That's when Lindsey finally noticed me. What the hell are you doing on this flight? She exclaimed, her voice dripping with venom. You set this up to embarrass me. I leaned back in my seat, calm and collected. I'm not the one embarrassing you. He's the one calling you his girlfriend. Lindsey's face turned red as she glared at me. You've ruined everything. I hate you. I hate being married to you. Her words stung, sharper than I expected, but I stayed steady, hoping against hope that there was still a way to salvage what was left. I was shocked, feeling like I had truly lost her. Grabbing my briefcase, I was about to walk off the plane when something unexpected happened. Harris, in his usual aggressive manner, waved his ticket in my face. Instinctively, I snatched it from him. My voice, though shaky, held firm as I asked, whose name is on this ticket? I showed it to Lindsey, and confusion spread across her face. Mike? Who is Robert Harris? She asked, her voice trembling. Harris yanked the ticket back and crumpled it, trying to dodge the truth. There's no name on it, he muttered angrily. The flight attendant stepped in, urging us all to take our seats, but Harris kept pushing, demanding to sit next to his so-called girlfriend. His disrespectful tone snapped me back to reality. Tears welled up in my eyes as I looked at Lindsey and quietly revealed Harris's true identity. I handed her a copy of the bench warrant, explaining that Harris had an outstanding warrant for unpaid child support. He's living large while neglecting his own kids, I added, handing her the document. Her hands trembled as she took it. Mike, what's going on? Is this true? She whispered, her eyes searching for an answer. I pushed forward. While you're at it, ask him why he didn't bother getting you a return ticket. I handed her the itinerary, showing her that only his ticket was round trip. Lindsey's face tightened with worry. Why don't I have a return ticket? She asked, her voice barely audible. Harris, ignoring her, continued arguing with the flight attendant. I leaned in closer. Did he also forget to tell you he spent 2 years in jail for assaulting his wife so badly she was in the hospital for a month? I've got the proof. I handed her photos of his ex-wife's injuries. Lindsey's face went pale. She turned to Harris, pleading, tell me this isn't true. But he stayed silent, more interested in his argument than defending himself. I wasn't finished. Maybe Google his real name next time, I added, passing her a stack of articles with his mugshot. He did the same thing before, tricked a woman into going skiing, and it ended horribly. The plane fell silent as I finished speaking. Lindsey broke down, tears streaming down her face. "Mike, please, this can't be happening," she whimpered. But Harris wasn't paying attention, and I could see her hope slipping away. Finally, Harris snapped. "I'm going to kill you," he shouted, lunging at me, but I dodged his wild punch. Instead, he hit the flight attendant square in the face. Chaos erupted. My seatmate, a college athlete with impressive size, grabbed Harris and restrained him until security showed up. The police didn't hesitate to cuff him, and he learned the hard way that assaulting a flight crew member was a felony. As they escorted Harris off the plane, he was still yelling, "I had your wife." My heart sank, and I turned to Lindsey, silently begging her to deny it. But she couldn't even look at me. An airline security guard approached, telling me we'd both be handed over to the Chicago police for questioning due to the incident. As we walked off the plane, I noticed the other passengers snapping photos and recording the scene. It was the real moment of humiliation for Lindsey, though she remained utterly silent. Walking through the airport felt surreal. Part of me was exhausted, but I also felt a strange sense of closure. I knew I had done everything I could to save our marriage, but deep down, I realized that I couldn't force it anymore. The police separated us for questioning, and I spent hours going over every detail about Harris. Eventually, they left me in a small room with stale coffee while they checked with their colleagues in Fort Collins. I paced, my mind spinning with 1,000 questions. Did Lindsey really betray me, or was Harris lying just to tear us apart? When the detective came back, he confirmed the worst. "We found evidence in Colorado," he said, his voice grim. The rundown shack Harris was planning to take her to had been prepped with restraints, chains, and sedatives. They had everything ready for their next victim, the detective continued. "Your wife wouldn't have stood a chance." Lindsey had seen the photos and heard their confessions. The moment she realized what could have happened, she passed out cold. The detective sighed, suggesting I talk to her. "She's shaken up. Be careful what you say. You did all of this to save your marriage, right?" I nodded, though my heart wasn't sure anymore. "You give her those divorce papers now, you'll break her completely," he warned. "She knows she messed up, big time. Right now, you're the hero. Don't throw that away." I sat there quietly for a moment, looking down at the divorce papers I had prepared. I had planned to give them to her at Harris's little love nest, but now, everything felt different. I made up my mind. "If she apologizes, I'll tear them up today," I said, trying to hold on to some sliver of hope. A minute later, they brought Lindsey into the room. She looked terrible, pale and sickly, her face streaked with tears. She couldn't even meet my eyes, sinking into the chair, shaking with sobs. The detective stood over her, speaking firmly. "Mrs. White, you're lucky to be alive. You owe your husband everything." Then he left, and the room fell silent. I sat there, waiting for her to speak, but she didn't say a word. I felt my heart breaking all over again. "You risked everything for a $1,500 ski trip," I finally said, my voice soft but heavy. "How can I ever trust you again?" Still, she remained silent, crying but unable to form a response. The tears rolled down my face too, and I waited, desperately hoping she'd say something, anything, to make this right. Finally, I stood up. "If you had just said sorry, I would have torn up these papers," I whispered, placing the divorce papers in front of her. Lindsey screamed, and a detective rushed back in to check on her. "I've already packed my things," I said quietly. "Whatever's left, you can toss or donate. Here are the keys." I handed them over and walked out, feeling the weight of finality with each step. The next time I saw her was in court. The judge ordered us to go through counseling, and I agreed, though I knew in my heart that I was done. The counseling didn't help, as expected, and after 7 months, our divorce was finalized. I never heard from Lindsey again, but I wasn't looking for closure. Harris was sentenced to prison for conspiracy, and I can only hope they keep him locked up for good.